Yesterday, we were looking at Chapter 14, War and Revolution, Part 1, The Road to World War I. Today we're going to cover Part 2, World War I itself. In 1 week, all of the major countries of Europe were at war. The Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which ended at the end of the year. The Allies were France, Great Britain, Russia, and Italy, which joined the following year in 1915. Italy had changed its mind, been persuaded by France and Britain to join them. Some countries did stay neutral: Switzerland, Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, not to mention the United States. Everyone thought it would be a fast war. Everyone believed they would be home for Christmas. "40 million soldiers went off to war, believing it would be glorious and fast." This is a train, a boxcar with German soldiers. You can see where they've taken chalk and they've written on the outside. One of the things is Ausflug nach Paris, which means we're on to a vacation at Paris. So you can see that no one really had any idea about the horrors that they were heading into. Europe had not experienced a major war since the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, so they had no idea how destructive a war could be. But this was a new type of modern war, much deadlier than any war fought before. It would be called total war. Long, deadly battles using new destructive weapons created by the new industrial age, and civilians would be caught up in the war. First, we'll focus on the Western Front. Germany knew it would be a two-front war. France and Britain were on their western border, while Russia was on their eastern border. But their plan was to defeat France first and then turn on Russia. They felt Russia would take longer to mobilize their army. Germany's plan, which was called the von Schlieffen Plan, was a lightning attack through Belgium, sweep around Paris, and surround most of the French army. I mean, after all, it worked in the Franco-Prussian War. Unfortunately, it took them longer to move through Belgium. And then a French attack at the First Battle of the Marne on September 6th to the 10th stopped the German advance. French generals loaded thousands of French reserves into Paris taxis and had them driven to the front. Then the French soldiers started to dig trenches, which led to the Germans digging trenches. So France would develop into trench warfare, and both sides would remain in the same place basically for the next 4 years. Now on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was very mobile. The Russian army invaded Germany, but was decisively defeated at the Battle of Tannenberg, late August 1914. The German army was led by General Paul von Hindenburg and his assistant, General Erich Ludendorff. Russia was no longer a threat to Germany. The Russian casualties were very high, 170,000 lost. The Germans lost less than 2,000. Austria-Hungary does not do well in the war. In 1950, Italy went against their agreement and joined the Allies and fought against Austria. And Austria will spend the rest of the war fighting the Italian army. Now, trench warfare developed in France. There were hundreds of miles of trenches separated by a no man's land. Here we see a photograph of a British trench. You see the British soldier. They do not want to put their head above the level of the trench or it would get shot at. The other men you see lying around the trench are not dead, they're actually sleeping. Here we see a picture of no man's land. Most of the trees, almost all the trees, have been destroyed. Generals were trained to fight in the open and did not know how to handle trench warfare. Many sent large amounts of soldiers against the enemy trenches in suicidal charges where millions died. Here we see the British going what they called over the top. Usually a whistle would sound and then they would charge up over the trench and immediately the German machine guns would start firing at them. Charges mostly failed because new weapons like the machine gun would kill thousands. Here we see a British Vickers machine gun. It could fire 100 bullets in a minute, which would be devastating against enemy infantry, much less cavalry. Large battles such as Verdun and the Somme led to massive casualties. In 1916, the Battle of the Somme, the British suffered 20,000 killed in one day. In the Battle of Verdun, in 10 months, 700,000 men died. From 1914 to 1917, neither side gained any real territory. Technology made the war deadlier. Airplanes, first used for scouting, then they started mounting machine guns on, where they could fight each other in the air. These fights became known as dogfights. Here we see an artist's rendition of a dogfight, the German plane with the Iron Cross, firing at a British plane which has the red, white, and blue bullseye. The airplane had only been invented 10 years earlier by the Wright brothers. And World War I was the first war in which the aircraft was deployed on a large scale. Ace fighter pilots were portrayed as modern knights. Many became popular heroes. All sides developed agile planes with machine guns, mostly biplanes. Though, of course, we see here the German Fokker triplane. It was flown by their most famous pilot. German Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, was the all-time ace with 80 kills. He was killed himself in the war in 1917 when flying low in a dogfight. Soldiers on the ground from Australia fired up at his plane and hit him. Submarines were used to sink enemy surface ships. Here we see a German submarine known as an Unterseeboot or U-boat. Tanks, created to break through trench warfare stalemates. Trench warfare and machine guns caused the development of tanks. In 1915, the British were the first to develop tanks. They mounted an armored car onto a tractor. Later, they actually developed one from a large water tank. That's where the name comes from. The French produced more tanks than all the other countries put together. In 1917, at the Battle of Cambrai, tanks were used in large numbers. 474 British tanks to break through the German lines, but they were just too slow to be effective. The British Mark IV tank had a top speed of 4 miles per hour. They built about 1,200. But early tanks were unreliable and they broke down often. But tanks proved to be a major mechanized weapon of the future. Here we see the US M1 Abrams tank, considered by many to be the best in the world. It had a top speed of 56 miles per hour on the road and 40 miles per hour off the road. Poison gas. Poison gas was used throughout the war. It caused terror, but fewer casualties. Gas masks reduced effectiveness, and wind shifts made it unpredictable. You could fire shells of gas at your enemy, the wind could shift, and the gas would then start heading back toward you. Less than 3% of the casualties in the war, about 30,000 men died for poison gas on the Western Front. Mostly also called blindness. That's why you see some of the British soldiers here, known as walking wounded, were blinded by the poison gas. After the war, they signed treaties to outlaw it and never use it again. And the most deadly of them all, the machine gun. Spraying 100 bullets over a field, it would cause deadly effects on enemy infantry and cavalry. In fact, the cavalry, which was a staple of the 18th century, these horse-mounted cavalry charges became obsolete. Now the war is going to expand. In 1915, both Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. The Allies tried to defeat the Ottoman Empire by landing troops at Gallipoli near Constantinople. The goal was the control of the Dardanelles. It became a disaster for the British, who were forced to withdraw. The Allies suffered over 300,000 casualties. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, who helped plan the attack, was among those blamed for its failure, causing him to resign from the government. Here we see some of the Ottoman troops with their machine guns. Many were Australians and New Zealanders of what they call the Anzac, A-N-Z-A-C. And despite suffering 250,000 casualties, it was an Ottoman victory. The war would also expand to Africa and Asia. Britain got control of much of the Middle East from the Ottoman Empire. Britain expanded control in China. Japan joined the war against Germany, seizing their colonies in the Pacific. Many of them they would use later in World War II. And the British and French colonials in Africa helped take German colonies. Naval warfare. Both Britain and Germany had large fleets of battleships. Germany also had the submarines, which we mentioned earlier, called the U-boats. Both sides wanted to keep the other from getting supplies by sea. The British Navy would blockade German ports, and German U-boats would sink merchant ships going to Britain. In 1916, the Battle of Jutland. The British and German navies fought a major battle off the coast of Denmark, as we can see here in the map. The battleships would just line up, bow to stern, and fire at the enemy. The goal was if you fire enough shots, you could sink the enemy ship. Here we see one of the British battle cruisers sinking. The British Royal Navy's Grand Fleet was under the command of Admiral Sir John Jellicoe against the Imperial German Navy's High Seas Fleet under Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer. Neither side won, and it was the last major battle fought primarily by battleships in history. Though the German fleet did not lose, they never again left port to fight the British Royal Navy. The end of the war. In 1917, military setbacks in Germany caused the Reichstag to lose power. Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff, with a new conservative government, create a military dictatorship. This becomes the first totalitarian society, a precursor for the National Socialism that would follow in 1933. Neutral United States was sending supplies to Great Britain on ships, and German U-boats started sinking American ships. In May of 1915, a U-boat sinks the British liner Lusitania. 1,200 people die, among them 128 Americans. The ship sank in an amazing 18 minutes. This was a poster that was used in Britain to take up the sword of justice. You can see the Lusitania sinking in the background with bodies floating in the water. Americans are outraged, and the sinking of the Lusitania moved America closer to war with Germany. In 1917, German submarine attacks increased. This was too much for America. Germany is desperate to break the stalemate in France. They feel with submarine warfare they could starve Britain into surrendering. They knew it would probably bring America into the war against them, but they could force Britain into surrendering before the American army could get to France. They were wrong. April 1917, the United States declares war on Germany. 2 million U.S. soldiers would go to France, but it would take almost a year before the American army arrives. Basically, this is because we really didn't have an army when we declared war. We had to set up a draft, recruit soldiers, train them, and then ship them to France. Now, 1917 was not a good year for the Allies. An Allied offensive in France failed. Food riots and revolutions in Russia forces them out of the war. People were getting tired of the war and the high death rate. On a positive side, America's entry into the war gave the Allies hope. Now, in 1918, Germany plans on a last-ditch, all-out attack to win the war. They plan on a major spring offensive to capture Paris. Germany needs to win before the Americans can arrive. So in March of 1918, General Ludendorff makes a major offensive towards Paris. They break through the Allied trenches. By April, they're only 35 miles from Paris. July 18th, the Second Battle of the Marne. The Allies, with the help of the new American troops, stopped the Germans and saved Paris. In August, the Allies started a counterattack to drive the Germans back. It was called the 100 Days Offensive. It was the first successful Allied offensive. Germany will never be on the offensive again. Germany was falling apart at home, anti-war marches became frequent, and morale in the army fell. September 26th, the Battle of the Argonne Forest, the final battle of the war. It was led by American forces and lasted 7 weeks to November 11th. 1.2 million American soldiers fought. It destroys the German ability to stop the Allies. By the fall of 1918, the German army is in full retreat. Field Marshal Erich von Ludendorff tells the Kaiser they cannot win the war. 9. November 9th, food riots in Germany forced Kaiser Wilhelm II to abdicate. A new social democratic government takes over. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg persuaded the Kaiser to abdicate for the greater good of Germany. Ludendorff tells the new government that the war is lost and they should try and end it. Ludendorff will conveniently forget this a few years later. Emperor Franz Joseph of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire dies in 1916, and his nephew becomes Charles I. Charles only rules for a couple years. In the fall of 1918, the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy collapsed very quickly. Military falls apart after defeat to the Italians at Vittorio Veneto in November of 1918. So on November 11th, 1918, all the sides agree to stop shooting at each other. This is called an armistice. The fighting ends. The Great War is over. There are 18 million dead. This is a French World War I cemetery. Another 20 million are wounded. Many of the soldiers who died in the war were unable to be identified. So Britain was the first country to actually bring one of those soldiers home and bury them in a place of honor in Westminster Abbey, and it became known as the British Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Other countries did the same thing. France buried their soldier under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The Canadian Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Ottawa. The Australian Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And of course, the American Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. Well, this concludes our section on World War I. Hope you enjoyed it. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.